When you think of heaven, do you imagine a distant, radiant paradise, a reward awaiting you after years of sacrifice and struggle? What if I told you that everything you thought about heaven was wrong, that the way to heaven is itself heaven, and that those you least expect might be standing beside you in eternity? This truth is as shocking as it is unsettling, and yet it is at the very heart of Christ's teachings. Today, I bring you a message so profound that it will shake your understanding of grace, justice, and divine love. Who truly enters heaven? Is it the righteous who have toiled their whole lives in devotion, or the sinner who repents in the final hour? This question has troubled believers for centuries, and the answer may not be what you want to hear. What if I told you that heaven is not a distant prize, but a reality unfolding even now? That the way we live and love in this very moment determines whether we are already stepping into eternity or locking ourselves in the prison of our own self-interest. The truth is radical, the implications life-changing. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might transform your faith forever. It was the sort of confession that could only happen in the darkest corners of the soul, the kind that makes even the most seasoned priest hesitate before offering absolution. Father Julian sat in the dimly lit confessional, the heavy wooden screen between him and the penitent barely obscuring the weight of what had just been spoken. The man on the other side exhaled shakily, as though unburdening his sins had stolen the last breath from his lungs. "Father, I don't deserve heaven," the voice rasped. "But they said God's mercy reaches even the worst of us. Is that true?" Father Julian had heard many confessions over the years. Liars, thieves, adulterers. But this one was different. The man before him was no ordinary sinner. He was a murderer, a man who had taken lives, shattered families, and walked in the shadows of violence and depravity for decades. And yet, here he was, moments from death, pleading for mercy. The priest closed his eyes, swallowing back the unease that threatened to creep into his voice. "God's mercy is infinite, my son. If you are truly repentant, He will not turn you away." There was silence, a long, painful silence. "Then forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The words came out broken, raw. The priest listened as the man recounted every crime, every unspeakable act he had committed in cold blood. The weight of his confession was crushing, suffocating. And yet, Father Julian knew what he had to do. He offered absolution, a sacrament that washed away the sins of the unworthy, a divine loophole for the dying. Minutes later, the man was gone. Father Julian emerged from the confessional, his hands trembling. How could it be? A man who had lived in pure evil for decades could now stand before the gates of heaven, while others, saints, martyrs, those who had dedicated their lives to God, were receiving the same reward? The very thought of it disturbed him in a way he had never experienced before. That night, sleep evaded him. The parable of the laborers in the vineyard tormented his thoughts. Those who had toiled all day received the same wage as those who arrived in the final hour. It had always been a difficult teaching, but now it had become personal. Was heaven truly that indiscriminate? Did it not matter what a man did with his life so long as he repented at the end? The days passed, and the unease grew. It gnawed at him in the quiet moments, in the solitude of his prayers. Then, one evening, something happened that changed everything. A woman entered the church just before closing. She was young, her face streaked with tears. She knelt at the altar, her body racked with silent sobs. Father Julian approached gently. "My child, are you in need of help?" She looked up at him, and the depth of her anguish nearly took his breath away. "He's dead," she whispered. "My father. He was a monster, Father, a monster who destroyed lives. And yet, before he died, they say he confessed that he was forgiven." Her voice cracked. "How is that fair? How can he be in heaven while the people he hurt still suffer?" Father Julian had no answer. His own turmoil mirrored hers. He wanted to offer her comfort, to tell her that justice would be done. But what justice was there in grace given so freely? That night, he prayed with a desperation he had never known. "Lord, help me understand," he begged. "How can this be right? How can heaven welcome those who have done so much wrong?" Then something happened. A light, a presence, filled the room. He was no longer in his church but in a vast and endless space, where the very air shimmered with something beyond human understanding. Before him stood a figure, cloaked in light, eyes filled with sorrow and love. "Why do you struggle so, my son?" The voice was neither loud nor soft, but it resonated through him with a force that shook him to his core. "Lord, I don't understand," Father Julian whispered. "How can a man who has lived a life of evil receive the same heaven as one who has spent his life serving you? How is that just?" Jesus looked upon him with infinite patience. "You see justice through the eyes of men, but my justice is not of this world. Would you have me refuse the one who returns to me in his final moments? Would you deny him what I freely give to all? But what of those who suffered? What of the ones he hurt?" Jesus' gaze was heavy with sorrow. "Their pain is real, and I grieve with them. But mercy is not a contest, my son. Love is not rationed out in portions according to effort. The one who labors all his life in my name is not cheated when his brother is saved at the last moment." Father Julian struggled to grasp the weight of these words. "But it doesn't seem fair." Jesus stepped closer, and in an instant, Father Julian saw what he had never seen before. The man he had absolved stood before him, but he was not triumphant. He was broken, humbled. The weight of his sins was etched into his soul. He had not escaped justice, he had been consumed by it. And yet, in his agony, he had found the love of God. "Heaven is not a prize for the perfect," Jesus said gently. "It is a home for those who have chosen me, even in the final hour." Tears burned in Father Julian's eyes. He had spent his whole life believing that holiness was something to be earned, that heaven was a reward for the righteous. But now he saw the truth. Heaven was not about fairness. It was about love. And love is never fair. It is extravagant. It is reckless. It is given where it is least deserved. When he awoke, he was back in his church, the weight of the vision still pressing upon him. He knelt before the altar, whispering a single prayer, "Thank you." The next morning, the young woman returned. She stood before him, her grief still raw, her heart still aching. "I don't know how to let this go, Father." He took her hands in his own, his voice steady. "Neither do I. But I do know this: love is greater than justice. And sometimes, mercy is the hardest thing to understand." She looked at him, searching for something, and then, for the first time, she nodded. It was not resolution, it was not peace, but it was a beginning. As she left, Father Julian looked up at the crucifix above the altar. He understood now, the scandal of grace, the mystery of love, and he knew, in the depths of his soul, that heaven was far more than he had ever imagined.